G'day, my name is Ben Hazlitt, if you've just heard. Thank you for coming along to my presentation. The value of Nuffield is not just in the presentations that we'll give to you today and here. And what I mean by that is, how often does a regular farmer get to go and discuss gun control with a bunch of blokes in back blocks in Nebraska, or sit with the president of a farmers' union in Paris, or spend time with a researcher in Spain talking about hyperspectral and thermal imaging and how that's going to affect our precision farming, or even sit with the ex-Federal Treasurer talking about how he made decisions and what role the Reserve Bank's got. So I think that is the broader benefit of Nuffield to us and what we can bring back into our learning, and it's not just this one focused topic. So I'd like to thank Nuffield for sending me on that journey. I very much appreciate the opportunity I've had. I'd like to thank all the sponsors that are involved to make the program possible, and in particular, Horticulture Innovation Australia for me. And the other big group that's involved that invests in all the Nuffield scholars are obviously their families and the people that make it possible. So I'd like to thank my parents and the people back on the farm, and in particular my wife and kids who hold the fort while we're away. So our family farm is situated at a place called Mertho, which you don't find on the map too easily, which is near Paringa, Riverland of South Australia. The river is the lifeblood of our region, and what we do without it, we're a pretty semi-arid region, and well, not at the moment actually, but normally. And the success of our region, the health of our towns is really reliant on that river, and so when the river's healthy, generally so are we. We grow citrus, almonds, wine grapes and stone fruit. We pack and market. We've been exporting direct into Asia for 20 years now. We keep a few honeybees for pollination because no bees, no nuts in the almond game. And 3 years ago, because we like being close to the market and like getting rewarded for a quality product, we started to make wine because we weren't seeing the returns we should. After the first year, we're all getting a little bit worried that we're going to be alcoholics because we're going to have to drink the lot. But thankfully, things have progressed. So when you travel around as a Nuffield scholar, you're a bit like a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. I had a few things on my mind I wanted to study, and I didn't just limit myself to one. I'll talk to you about one today. But a couple of the things I really looked at was whether or not I could peel skin off fruit automatically to give value to a product that otherwise we'd been throwing away. And another one is I think we can make a major step change in horticulture by, funnily enough, using pivot technology. It opens up for us precision farming, and I've looked in detail at how I can do that with thermal imaging and other help. But today I really wanted to talk to you about how farmers can get what they need, and more specifically how rural regions can get what they need. And you go, well, why does that matter terribly much? Well, it matters because, you know, our rural regions provide about 93% of the daily food we consume, over about 52% of the land mass. And if we can take into account the complete supply chain, we add about 1.6 million jobs. There's about 300,000 direct, but the others are the value-added jobs. And that ends up being about 12% of Australia's GDP value-added. And so we're clearly a pretty important industry to Australia, and we're pretty important to rural Australia. So for us, we need to get things done that we need to get done, and that really has a major effect on Australia and rural Australia. So what stops that happening? So firstly, where did I go? Who did I talk to? What did I find? And then what do I think we should do about it? So from the map you can see I zipped around the place a bit. I started in Canberra at ABARES. I went to California. I'm pretty interested in horticulture. Through into the middle of Nebraska, then into France and down through France and round through Spain, and then back up to the Netherlands, Hong Kong and home. And I talked to a whole range of people. So I talked to farmers, farmers' unions, politicians, advisors, researchers, any man in the street. And the reason I did that in the rural areas is to try and get a really good understanding of the things that people think are problems and the things that people think are solutions. And you have some pretty interesting conversations with people as you cruise around the world. I remember talking to one fellow who I left there, I was going for 1 hour, and 7.5 hours later, I left his place. And it was really interesting. He talked to me about things like, you know, why they vote for Donald Trump, and even though they don't like him. And it gives you a good idea as to what some people in other parts of the world are thinking, and particularly a country that does affect us. And for the record, he said, well, it seems everyone's heading towards socialism and the establishment. He's the antithesis of that, and that's why we're going to vote for him. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So the crux of the problem is, if we want change in rural areas, how do we get it? And so what I really wanted to know was how the key decision makers that we need to act on our behalf think, and basically what makes them make crappy decisions at times. And I actually asked it like that sometimes because a lot of people in politics, I'm sure, even though we might not think it always, don't go in with the worst of intentions, but we see a compromise along the way. So what causes that? And we've got to be part of the solution too. So what can we do better in regional Australia to help make good decisions? And so together, what can we do to get a better outcome for us all? So what did I find? Certainly there's similarities no matter where you go, wherever in the world you are. A lot of it's around centralisation. When I was in Spain, they were all complaining, crikey, if you want to take a train from Valencia and you want to get down south to Cordoba, you have to go via Madrid. Why is that? What do they think they are? They're the centre of the world. And it's a very similar thing in a lot of places you go, that we think everything has to happen in the city. So it's not just us. Money for infrastructure, people often raise that as a point. No voting power. Interestingly, California, huge industry, especially in my horticultural world. I talk to those guys and they say, hey, we've got no power. I'm going, are you serious? But they say, Ben, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, just there. They don't care about us. Quite interesting. And also a lot of people talk about the disconnection of the rural regions and the cities. They say that, you know, when somebody goes to the doctor, they don't want 100-year-old medicine, but a lot of them think we should be 100-year-old technology farmers. So there are a lot of differences as well. Some of it's public perception. In France, there's certainly a very much different public perception to farming than there is in Australia. More a custodian of the land, that's certainly the case. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with distance. When you get back here, there's a much greater distance between us and the general populace. And I think as time and generations go on, there's less family links. Also policies. If you look, you've got the Common Agricultural Policy, which is really a social policy in Europe. And I'll talk to the Netherlands farmers about that and they say, yeah, that insulates us from a lot of the market forces. And so that's something that is obviously very different from here. And so those sorts of things can cause big problems. And my notes are just not going where I wanted. And so we've got to look at those differences and go, all right, where do they affect us and what can we do about it? So what did I find? Politicians need to talk to people with mandates. They need to talk to people that actually have something behind them. So how do you get that? In Spain, when I talked to the unions, they said they were giving that because they went from the grassroots level. They represented not just people in stone fruit, not just people in livestock, the whole range of agriculture, and that gave them the mandate. Interestingly, when I talked to people in the federal government here, they said Australia's representation is very poor compared to what it had been in the past with regard to that flow of information, to having a group that really spoke for us. And so that's not a good thing. Often they are saying we're accepting the least worst option, which is not a good thing for us, and that we should be parking our tractors on the lawn more often. The ministers are telling me this, and that seems a bit strange. Relationships. Relationships are obviously very important. And the French Farmers Union, when I talk to those, they say, well, actually, the president of the Farmers Union said, well, I meet with the minister's staff weekly. So I know what's going on and so that I can inform them. I only meet with the minister monthly because those staffers are really the people we need to interact with to help the policy get across the line. And also, as communities, we need to think in Australia, our politicians are also looking for links into our community. So how are they deciding who they're going to talk to apart from the big people that represent us? So when we're at a meeting, they're looking around at you. Who's talking sensibly? Who can I talk to on a one-to-one basis that might give me a different point of view? So we need to make sure we build pathways to both sides of politics. That's something else I've been told. And the MDBA, Murray-Darling Basin Authority, that sort of stuff and the changes we made, the plan we made, some of those things wouldn't have happened if there'd been a Conservative government. So it's interesting that we've got to make sure we take into account the benefits we can have by building strong relationships with both sides of politics. We need to build a really good case. There's not much point trying to get your point across if you don't have a case. So when you're looking at building a case, I talked to some professors at UC Davis about that, and they said one of the things they did wrong in a drought was they said, oh look, food supply is threatened by all this water. The trouble was the public looked at it and said, just as many tomatoes, the oranges are the same. They couldn't see it. What had shifted was water had shifted from some lower value pasture crops into some high value thing, but generally the consumer couldn't see it. So they didn't build their case very well, because the real case was the farmers were suffering, but they weren't leaving the land. The people that worked for the farmers lost their jobs. The communities around those farming communities were in trouble. That was the case. We need to make sure we detail the benefits of the case we build. We need to make sure we let people know that that the people that are pushing our case, we've got to help them with, this could be the fallout. This is what you've got to look out for, and these are potential solutions to the fallout as part of our case. The ultimate decision maker in all these things is the person that holds the purse strings. And in our particular country, that's the Treasurer. And when I talk to the Treasurer, or ex-Treasurer, Peter Costello, about this, you say, well, what do you think about this? And he said, well, what I'm thinking about is what benefits the taxpayer the most and what's not going to cause anarchy in the streets. What decision? He said, you better be bloody precise when you come to me if you want money, because I've got to take it from somewhere and put it somewhere else. You better make sure there's some consensus in your community about it. So that's something we've really got to consider and make sure we understand. And media. There is no politician that's immune to their face on the front page or on four corners. Those sorts of things have a big impact. So we've got to be understanding of that. And hey, we all like to be liked too. So when we charge people to go forward and prosecute our case, we need to make damn sure we give them the ammunition as well. So some of the obstacles to getting the things we want done. And I'll talk to you about an Australian context, but with other examples, because if I don't talk to you in an Australian context, the information's worthless. A lot of the time you hear people say, divide and conquer. It's competition. We do it to ourselves generally. If we can be divided, it means our case wasn't very good in the first place. When I talk to some of the guys in the US about how they prosecute their case to the federal government, they say we have all our fights locally. We get that over and done and dusted, and it's not often. The researcher that I was talking to said that we really spread out in different angles once we get to the federal level. The other thing we need to think about, if you think you've got a strong case, it's got to compete with cabinet time. If you want the federal government to talk about this, it better be important economically, structurally or socially. It's a busy place. Money. Money, the bucket doesn't change. And I had politicians from different countries say the same thing to me, that the losers always complain much louder than the winners clap. And we need to think about that too. If we get what we want, don't just go away. Make sure you let people know, because it's hard to deal with the complaints. So if something goes well for our industries, we may need to make sure, hey, well done. I don't care where you're from, what side of politics, you've done a great job. So there's structural barriers and vested interests in all of these sorts of things we need to think about. And structural barriers in Australia might be COAG, trying to get through the Council of Australian Governments. There's vested interests. And some of those, I've been told by ministers here and treasurers here, that if you've got $40 or $50 million in Australia, you can change the effect that there might be of a decision. And if you don't believe that, you think about work choices, big advertising campaign, or the mining tax, big advertising campaign. We need to be aware of those things. And as I mentioned before, politicians kept telling me we're people too, so we need to make sure we provide the support to those people that we want to prosecute change. So what do I think we should do? We need to tell our story. We need to stop ducking our heads, stop trying to be a small target, get on the front foot and actually be someone that people come to hear the story, not just run around putting fires out. So that's talking about leading the regional discussion. And a case in the Netherlands of that, I talked to a lady, a farmer, who was very prolific in social media. And when there came to be an animal husbandry problem, she was an area of trust that people could come to because she'd built that already. It wasn't just saying, no, trust me now, there's a problem. She'd built that before. We need to target people that we need help from. And really, that should be ministerial advisors, as they are talking about in France and Spain to me, that you want to get that information into those people because they are advising the people you need on the decision. Politicians from both sides, key educators. One of the big things in the US I found is a lot of their key researchers went into government and then came back. And that was a really powerful thing because they're often very well linked to the commodities. And key media, because they're opinion makers and opinion changers. How often do we as individuals feed good news stories to the media? I mean, I know we do it, and there's some people a lot better than others at it, but it is something that is really important. And we need to take ownership of our story. Don't complain about it, take ownership of it and try and drive that change. Our region's not particularly good at that. We leave it up to others to prosecute our case and tell our story. And the wine grape growers in our region know that very well. They left it to the big wineries. Whereas if you went to Champagne, all of their marketing dollars are going into the marketing region, not saying drink champagne, just saying how wonderful it is. And the drinking champagne is a byproduct. So they're really pushing themselves. And it's hard to do on your own. So, I'll wrap up really quickly. It's hard to do on your own, so I think there is real worth in regional hubs. We see cluster groups in the Netherlands, we see groups that work together in Spain, and the big thing that I think about is it shouldn't just be agriculture. As regions, we need to work together across the whole range of things. And I think we've got, with the range of industries housed together, an ability to tell a really good story. And with that, I want to leave you with a quote that I like, that farming is freedom, from the US Secretary of Agriculture. Fewer than 2% of Americans live and work on farms to feed 98% and to give them freedom to do other things. So for Australian farmers to enjoy that sort of freedom that we supply people, who have we left in charge of telling our story? Thank you.